for the second semester. And this semester, just so you know, we have our wonderful honors class, seminar class with us, which actually means that the speaker will not start speaking before 3:35 p.m. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't come at 3:30 to get your coffee, hear the announcements, but lest you think I'm just being my usual late and slow self, I'm blaming it on them.
Oh, sure.
So welcome, guys. It's nice to have you here. I want to make a couple of announcements before I do a very brief introduction to our speaker, because I know you would far rather hear him than me. So next week, for the IAS Thursdays, we are going to be upstairs in the Best Buy Theater, and our program is going to be on the Fluxus movement on manifestations through visual and performing arts. It's in connection with with Northrop, our partner Northrop, and the Walker Art Center, and a ballet production by the Ballet de Lorraine, and there are cheap tickets, free tickets for students, cheap tickets, available through the Northrop box office. But our program is, of course, as always, free and open to the public. It'll be upstairs at 3:30 p.m. and it'll also, there's going to be an exhibit in the gallery space upstairs on the Fluxus movement. So come and enjoy. The other thing I wanted to point out is on this IAS forum, and you do need to click on the blue word at the moment, we've just posted a new piece by Pat Nunnally. So if you click on the blue, you go here, you go down to the bottom. On River Life, Place, Water, and Community. On February 9th, we're going to have a IAS Thursday around the issue of water, and we hope that you will read Pat's essay. Feel free to respond to it. If you have something of your own you'd like to post, please feel free to do that as well. And now we'll go back to the slides. Oops. So all of you who are eagerly following 140 characters at a time, the pace of the changes in the federal administration, may have noticed that most recently there have been announced some changes that will affect the National Endowment of the Arts, the National Endowment of the Humanities, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, etc. Now they can't tell you about that. They're not allowed to tweet, neither is the National Park Service. But we are going to have a brown bag lunch, bring your lunch. We'll provide drinks next Tuesday from 12 to 1:30 here in this room to brainstorm, how do we respond to these changes in our national cultural and scientific life, and I hope we'll see you there. So it's on beyond the posters to the down and dirty strategizing. Collaborative research and creative collaborative applications are due Friday, February 3rd at noon. Most people assume you're going to have until 5 p.m. or maybe even 11:59 p.m. At noon. The reason being is if you have a problem with the lovely university workflow system, you still have time to call Susanna and she will sort it out for you. So that's the noon piece. Well, we're really happy and honored to have today as our speaker, S.Eben Kirksey, who's the disciplinary convener of environmental humanities and also an Australia research fellow in, obviously, Australia, University of New South Wales at Sydney. Dr. Kirksey earned his Master's of Philosophy at the University of Oxford and his PhD from UC Santa Cruz. If you look on his webpage, it'll say, cultural and social anthropology. But really, I think he's kind of interdisciplinary with a capital I. Multi-species ethnography, not just interdisciplinary, but multi-species oriented. Last year, he was the Kirksey and Thomas A. Barton Visiting Professor at Princeton University. We are very happy to have him here in the Twin Cities today, where the weather, I'm sure, is better than Princeton. We know how to handle snow. He's published 2 books with Duke University Press, Freedom in Entangled Worlds, which came out in 2012, and most recently, Emergent Ecologies. You may notice that phrase is repeated in the title of today's talk, in 2015. But I have to say I'm voting for the next book with the title, Human Nature, Fast, Loose, and Out of Control. Professor Kirksey.
So before I start the talk today, I'm going to share a resource that one of your librarians offered to me last night. It's a tool from the field of multispecies studies to help gain some protection in the current political climate. So if you need protection from visual assaults by our new president, there's this little extension you can add to your Chrome browser that every time you visit a website that has Donald Trump's picture, this app knows how to replace Donald Trump's face with kittens. So it's called Make America Kittens Again. So just in case you need some resources here in this new era of American politics. So in all seriousness, one of the things that this book is trying to describe are bubbles of hope and happiness at the intersection of powerful force fields. Sometimes things are beyond our immediate capacity to intervene or control. And I'm going to be talking about households, domestic spaces today, where people are creating small little bubbles of hope. And one of the questions in this book is at a particular historical juncture, at the intersection of these powerful force fields, how do you probe those fields of possibility amidst ongoing catastrophic disasters? So the book tries to avoid the discourse of apocalypse, rather than anxiously await for environmental disasters that are looming on future horizons. I'm trying to figure out how to describe and characterize and celebrate, in some instances, concrete acts of love and care in intimate spaces that can be shielded from hostile forces. The book also celebrates unruly forms of life that are escaping beyond regimes of care and control and love. So things that are exceeding, a lot of conservation projects involve careful management of populations or species. And the book celebrates forms of life that are disruptive to things that we care about sometimes. So this is a picture of a fungus, the chytrid fungus, a kind of life that is destroying worlds that I care about. It's epidemic disease that is driving frogs extinct right now. And I basically use this fungus to take on one of the most prominent theorists of human exceptionalism. So there's this guy named Peter Sloterdijk. He's a German, and he styles himself as the second coming of Martin Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger is this philosopher who's famous or infamous for being the 20th century philosopher who, more than anyone else, insisted that humans are exceptional, that we're different than others. And I'm not going to say much about Heidegger, but Sloterdijk's theory of human exceptionalism is interesting and kind of quirky. He says that we're amphibious, and I'll sort of slow down and tell you what he means by being amphibious. So the book talks about literal amphibians, and some of which are endangered, but what I'm going to try to describe are ontological amphibians. So Sloterdijk says that animals move around in an ontological cage, this bounded world. He says that humans are constantly switching from one element to another. He claims that the human being is a moving animal which longs to change elements and go somewhere else. This is what it means for him to be an ontological amphibian. So if a literal amphibian chooses amongst modes of existence, air or water, his ontological amphibian is choosing amongst worlds. He says the human never just sticks to one world, but always faces a decision about what kind of ontology to inhabit. So I see some quizzical expressions here, so I'll try to illustrate it with some other figures. So this is a fungus that is disrupting our worlds, and it inhabits different morphologies and ontologies depending on what kinds of life are in worlds around it. Another figure of the ontological amphibian in my book, I think some of you read the chapter on monkeys. The honor students here read this chapter. So this is a rhesus macaque. They've been living in the wilds of Florida for some 80 years, rumored to have escaped from the original Tarzan movies with Johnny Weissmuller in 1932. Rumor's not exactly true, it's sort of true, but not entirely true. But this is among the other primates on Earth right now. This is the one primate, the rhesus macaque, the rhesus monkey, that is really good at getting into other kinds of worlds. It's not limited to any one environment. It's flourishing in urban landscapes in India. Here it's living along a river in Florida, the Silver River. And the animals that I'm going to talk about today also have that sort of amphibious nature. They're able, the main ones that I'm going to talk about today are birds that are really clever at getting inside of human social worlds, often able to respond to our desires for touch. Earlier today, if you were here in this room for Jean's talk, she talked about how touch is policed in primate sanctuaries, how people want to touch chimpanzees, but insurance companies and people who want to sort of police this boundary have shut that down. But these birds that I'm going to tell you about today are really good at sort of attending to our social norms and expectations, and even entering kinship expectations. So I'm going to tell you about Carolyn Elliott, someone I call Carolyn Elliott. She's a woman in her 60s who lives in a mobile home in Florida, a suburb of Miami. And studying the home economics of multi-species families in her household helped me understand this idea that I'll introduce in a little bit, this notion of the flexible person. Caroline, when I visited her, she introduced me to her babies in a makeshift aviary on the back porch. And as I first entered this space, I was wondering if this is just sort of an anthropomorphic imposition, an imposition of human categories onto animals. And we're going to take some wandering journeys, but we'll get to the place where it's an unexpected, kinky place where I think there's really clear evidence that it's not just a unilateral imposition here. So this makeshift aviary is on the back porch of her double-wide mobile home, and she's got this assortment of cages strewn through her backyard as well, alongside salvaged lawnmowers, motorcycles, and golf carts. One of her favorite babies, Myrtle, is a Hans macaw, and readily engages in mimetic play, more or less. Caroline says, "Myrtle, want a grape?" Myrtle says, "Caw, caw." Caroline, "No, it's not cold, it's warm out. Want to sing like Nana? Sing. Ah, 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 ah. Sing, Myrtle. Nah. Myrtle, ah, 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 ah. Want an apple? Caroline laughs. Give Nana a kiss. And then she pushes the beak up against her lips and gives Myrtle a kiss. So after this kiss, Caroline explained that birds learn to make noise when we pucker. They make a moi noise every time she kisses them, since they carefully listen to people. Right before they get to your mouth, they'll open up their beak and just kind of push your lip, she explained. Caroline and Myrtle arguably share a social space, a bubble of happiness that I was referencing in the beginning of the talk. Friends and family call her the bird whisperer because of her ability to work with animals that others regard as mean or intractable. So basically she injured her back and had to retire, and how she makes money these days is she scours Craigslist and goes to flea markets and looks for birds that have social problems in human households, birds that are biters, birds that other people don't want to live with. And she basically trains them to be better people and sells them for added value on the internet. She teaches them to respect our social norms and our desires for touch. So she basically turns them into our babies and then sells her babies online. David Schneider insists that kinship is social, or it is nothing. Schneider assumed that kinship involves the socialization of biological processes. In playing with the boundaries of kinship, mixing the biological and social relations in creative ways, Caroline proved to be ever ready to draw new people and new birds into her flexible family network. While we were interacting with Myrtle, she received a phone call from Jean, the former owner of Polly, a red-shouldered macaw. These networks of people and birds connect them. Jean is like my sister, she said. She's interested in doing trades. I love doing trades, especially with her. She has a thing, 2 for 1. I give her 1 bird, she gives me 2. And she gives her a bird that's a better, more sociable and better able to respond to these desires to touch, and she gives her 2 problematic birds. This phone call gave Carolyn an opportunity to further describe her skills as a bird whisperer, a savvy entrepreneur, and a social networker. The 2 for 1 deals were on offer because Caroline was capable of making, again, these birds more sociable and personable. She talked about her extended network of fictive kin, and as she was doing this, a little Australian budgie named Peeps flew out of nowhere and landed on her hand. While Caroline continued to gush about her favorite babies, I considered the serious possibility, again, that she was just making these anthropomorphic and anthropocentric projections by addressing these non-human animals and calling them her kin. Studies of kinship by anthropologists who study people have historically projected Eurocentric and ethnocentric assumptions onto the social lives of others in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. As Peeps and Caroline playfully interacted, as he lightly pecked at her fingernails and then started rapidly rubbing his tail feathers over the knuckle of her thumb, I suddenly realized that the small bird was projecting its own norms about sociality and sexuality of his species onto a human. When Peeps finished, he fluttered off and left a small droplet of semen and a bright red drop of blood on Carolyn's hand. Wiping her hands with a nearby towel, she let this kinky moment pass without comment. And she didn't miss a beat as she continued to tell me about the relationships with different members of her household. I don't think I'll ever try to breed Myrtle, she said. How come, I asked. Because she's a pet. As Caroline continued to talk, I came to understand that birds are not endlessly flexible as persons. Birds can become human persons in a way that limits their capacity for social relations with their own avian kin. Later I found a website that explained. Many Hans macaw breeders will allow their parrots to form pairs, to raise a few of their young as they make wonderful breeders as adults. So basically hanging out with other birds when you're young makes you sort of desire birds when you're an adult and you become sexually active. A Hans macaw that's been tamed and imprinted on humans will probably never be bred sexually. So for this reason, the best Hans macaws breeders do not allow parrots to get too tame. So today I decided to give you the sort of PG-13 version of my talk. If you want to get kinkier, I direct you to Peter Singer, who has an essay on heavy petting. He's a very serious animal rights philosopher. When I showed up at Princeton last year, I was totally intimidated by this guy, but it turns out he's both really nice and personable and approachable, but also has this sort of dark horse kinky thing. So Google that article, heavy petting, if you really want to get kinky and hear about octopuses and dogs and all sorts of other things. But I'm going to just kind of leave it with that subtle encounter with peeps. But there's all manner of other species that project their own norms of sociality and sexuality onto people. It's not just a unilateral projection. So I suggest that multi-species families involve queer sensibilities in the sense that they're based on relationships involving choice and love. Biological ties are often decentered in gay and lesbian notions of kinship, and this is in the words of Kath Weston, who wrote a book called Families We Choose. Choice in multi-species families is often asymmetrical, with humans keeping others in conditions of captivity. Still, these critters that are folded into human families often choose to reciprocate by returning the love and affection and social advances of other household members. Imagining new kinds of relatedness, Janet Siskin argues that sociability is a pan-human, pan-primate, and pan-mammalian tendency, but molding this sociability in the forms of kinship and marriage is non-intrinsic and external. It's potentially discardable, just like the chrysalis of tomorrow's butterfly. So in the same way a butterfly molts becomes a butterfly from a caterpillar, we could get beyond these institutions of marriage and notions of sexuality, she suggests. But here we're talking about a non-primate example. So as people project concepts of kinship beyond the realms of primates and mammals, there's some creatures that share our sensibilities and others that don't. In other words, certain species are more flexible as persons or more ontologically amphibious than others. So this notion of flexible personhood is not my own. It belongs to the Israeli scholar Daphna Shir-Vertish, who's mostly talking about dogs in Israel. And what she showed is that, basically similar sort of setup. People call dogs their babies, and she noticed this thing. She did long-term field work over the course of like 5-10 years, and found that when an actual baby came along, suddenly the dogs were displaced. So, this young couples might endearingly call their dog a baby, but then when a human baby shows up, all of a sudden the dog is not allowed on the couch anymore. It's confined to the backyard, or in a number of cases, taken to the Humane Society and euthanized. So this notion of flexible personhood refers to that sort of selective incorporation and often violent rejection of animals from these human social spheres and kinship networks. So this notion of flexible personhood also invokes the work of David Harvey, who talks about flexible strategies for accumulating and selling things. And here we're talking about valuable animals. And this economy that Carolyn participates in on Craigslist and at flea markets has allowed countless Floridians to adapt to sweeping changes in political and economic landscapes. High unemployment and low property values following the housing market crash in 2008 led many entrepreneurs to start breeding animals and to trade them through these informal economic networks. While interviewing some of these entrepreneurs in Florida and other parts of the US, I found a large community of people who care for tropical birds, endangered frogs, venomous snakes, and lizards in their own home. Capital investment is necessary to get breeding projects off the ground. All these animals require specialized shelter, veterinary care, and food, and all of this is costly. It's also really costly to provide the entertainment, the love, and the affection for these animals, and it includes difficult daily labor. So we heard about related sorts of labor in Jean's talk today. Specialized experts who get trained in primatology and behavioral biology, but these folks are all learning to do this labor in the intimate spaces of their own home, watching YouTube videos, reading books, learning along the way through trial and error, making mistakes sometimes, getting hurt, killing their animals. Flexible labor processes have enabled a diversity of people to channel their love and passion for particular species into money-making ventures. As a result, spectacular life forms are multiplying in garages, studios, and basements, producing emergent ecological communities within human-dominated landscapes. Carolyn also introduced me to Dale, Rubino Burke, who is one of her friendliest babies. As Dale flew around on the back porch, comfortably perching on my shoulder, Carolyn revealed that some of her improvisation and play involved tinkering with the genetic building blocks of life. She showed me this online calculator that lets you enter in different characteristics of the birds and decide which birds you want to pair in breeding, basically using old 19th century Mendelian techniques with new digital tools. Dale is a good boy, she said, but birds like him don't exist in the wild. Burkes are normally blue, not this striking red and yellow, like this Rubino. So this mutation gallery online has this calculator that you can enter the characteristics of the parents in. So recessive genes for cinnamon, FD for faded, as well as dominant genes like V for violet or D for dark. You enter this all into the calculator and you can predict what your designer baby will look like. And she's basically creating new species, new forms of life. She showed me these pedigrees, which look like human family trees that she used to keep track of these dominant recessive genes. This DIY ethos of animal breeding has resulted in the creation of makeshift family laboratories where these age-old genetic principles are coming together with novel technologies for making sense of DNA. So what she was doing at this point, and my fieldwork's taking place 2008, 2009, is mostly reading DNA. She found this company in Brazil, and she learned how to read their website using Google Translate. So she gets these envelopes in the mail where she puts feathers, and she can send them back to Brazil and get birds sexed and identified by species. But now I'm starting to interview people who are writing DNA. So I interviewed a dog breeder a couple of weeks ago who has a plywood shed in his backyard in Mississippi. This new tool that I talked about yesterday, CRISPR-Cas9, lets you sort of dial up a gene anywhere in the genome and change DNA base pairs and write whatever kind of code you want and put it into a living organism. Carolyn's doing a different sort of DIY genetics slightly earlier, but this is changing really quickly right now. But there's a long history too. So animals became objects of curiosity in Victorian England, and Harriet Ritbo has written the definitive book on this. So breeders and naturalists were testing the limits of human abilities to manage this chaotic and unfathomable variety of nature. Lately, these experiments in interbreeding and crossbreeding have intensified and veered off along diverging lines of flight. Some of the projects she told me about were about preserving certain lines, sort of trying to freeze a line and prevent it from becoming something else. But then others were sort of this hybrid crossing of different species, mixing boundaries, creating wild forms of life. So some biologists are upset by this. They said the species boundaries should be maintained. These things shouldn't be crossed. And others are sort of more reserved and sort of, so some of the birds that she's bringing together are members of the same genus, but have been separated by geography for thousands of years. So she's bringing together birds from the mainland of the tropical Americas, together with birds from the Dominican Republic and Haiti and elsewhere, basically seeing what emerges as she mixes and matches. There's definitely feelings of ambivalence that are underpinning some of these breeding experiments. She showed me some freshly hatched cockatiels, which involved a cross of closely related parents, and the parents had won prizes at bird shows. These hatchlings, and I know it's a blurry picture, even to my untrained eye, looked sick. And Carolyn confirmed that some of their siblings had already died. She said, "I think it's a problem because their parents are too closely related, so I'm going to separate them. I'm generally against breeding relatives, but everyone with show birds promotes inbreeding, saying, oh no, you can't bring in those outside birds. But after what is going on with these two, I don't think I'm going to breed their relatives ever again. How would you feel if you had a baby and it died?" At the same time, Caroline appeals to claims of authority with direct access to the science of genetics. Some of her breeding experiments are at the same time undermining the authority of taxonomic scientists. She told me about her intention to cross a Nande conure with a sun conure to produce a hybrid, something that she called a Sunday conure, inventing a new name. This is the crossing of Aratinga nende and Aratinga solistalis, two definitive species. So as I experienced the full tour of Carolyn's double-wide mobile home, I noticed that some species of birds, the macaws, the African greys, the birks, the conures, were more flexible as persons than others. Some individual birds, like Myrtle, with her ready ability to mimic human speech and social responsiveness, were more personable than others. To play with my own queer jargon, these, again, animals were social amphibians, able to interact with beings in multiple social worlds. By comparison, her Gouldian finches, the diamond doves, parakeets, and cockatiels were less sociable with people, less attentive to Carolyn's desires for touch, interaction, response, and regard. Caroline was thus attached to some of her babies more than others. Even still, in tough economic times, she could not always ignore the exchange value of some of her most treasured loved ones. She cried when she told me about selling Randy a $5,000 Catalina macaw to pay for an overdue medical bill. Many other bird enthusiasts who I interviewed in Florida shared similar sentiments. They were attached to animals who were part of their family. Their feelings of well-being had become contingent on the well-being of the creatures in their care. When contingencies multiplied beyond their control and resulted in the death of a loved bird, people experienced intense emotional distress. Some pet owners who were not involved in breeding expressed horror at the thought of selling their flighty companions on the open market. Still, everyone I talked with understood that the animals and their families were vulnerable to sudden shifts amongst humans in the household. With a death, a divorce, a lost job, or a child headed away for college, the status of prized birds could suddenly be demoted, like the dogs that Daphne describes in Israel. And these moments of crisis in households present opportunities for someone like Carolyn, and she was always on the lookout for valuable orphans. Sometimes sudden shifts in human households gave the animals themselves an opportunity for freedom. One person told me on the condition of strict anonymity and confidentiality how her enraged husband opened up the cages of all the birds in her house one Sunday afternoon while she was out with her friends at the beach. The husband had grown tired of the incessant squawks and screeches and could not convince her to sell the birds. They've since divorced, and she's assembled a new multi-species family. She's a single mom with both birds and human kids. She now takes pleasure at imagining that her loved ones are now flourishing in the wilds of Florida. Smiling, she pulled Peterson's field guide off the shelf. This is the definitive guide to birds of North America. And she pointed to the page for parrots and parakeets, the family Pisticidae, I think that's how you say it. The only member of this family that was native and endemic to Florida, the Carolina parakeet, is now extinct. It went extinct in 1920. But now, a diversity of others have taken its place. By the latest count, there's 72 members of the parrot family in Florida. There's endless varieties of lorikeets, lories, galahs, budgies, cockatoos, macaws, lovebirds, in addition to parrots and parakeets. And those are just the identifiable species. That doesn't count for the hybrids that people like Carolyn have created and released. My anonymous source told me that she's amused that her own broken family has created the possibilities for new hybrid bird families. Rosemary Collard is a really interesting theorist of wildness, and she insists that the wild isn't anymore just something that's related to the domestic, that we must think about wildness in terms of overlapping ecological and social relationships that sometimes give the opportunity for a flourishing beyond our reach, beyond our realm of control. And my anonymous source was celebrating these forms of wildness. Her husband had released golden conures, an endangered bird from Brazil, a bird that doesn't have habitat where it comes from. So this golden conure has the ability to hybridize with closely related species from other places already in the wild of Florida. The Hispaniola parakeet, the orange-fronted parakeet. Some designer babies, like the ones that Caroline created, the rosy Burke mutants, and a Lutino cockatiel, were also released by this woman's husband. Florida has become home to diverse animals that were once separated by geography and history. Novel kinds of creatures are emerging within these contact zones, giving rise to new symbiotic associations. Even as some state officials talk about culling wild monkey populations, those pictures that I showed in the beginning, in the 80s there was an intense campaign to try to get rid of those monkeys. No one's really talking about these non-native birds. The state officials aren't trying to get rid of them. There's multi-species foraging flocks that are comprised of different kinds of parrots and parakeets, and you can now see these. They're common in Florida. What we see is the fickle play of human desires and capital that has produced these emergent ecological communities. So even though this was the poster child of today's talk, I'm not going to actually tell you much about snakes today, other than basically they don't want to be people. So this is a chondropython from West Papua. That's where I did my dissertation in the first book, and I was surprised to meet them in Florida. And they basically really don't want to live in human households. So I ended up interviewing some of the key, famous snake people in this world. And one of them has a special technique for keeping these snakes alive. So basically, the chondropython and the ball python have a very stereotypical fear response. The ball python is named, and this is like the snake that's really popular in these markets of pet breeders. It's named for its fear response. It basically spends a lot of the time just curled up in a little ball. That's what they do when they're afraid. These condor pythons do their best to die when they're in human captivity. But this guy, Greg Maxwell, figured out how to keep them alive. He grabs them by the back of the neck, takes a dead baby rat, picks it up with a pair of tongs, and jams it down their throat past their gag reflex. And Greg's got a rule, and that rule is Greg always wins. So it doesn't matter how many times the snake spits up the dead baby rat, it always goes down the throat. So I'm trying to juxtapose these different kinds of animals that live in human households to just give you the sense that some kinds of life are more flexible as persons than others. So this is a very expensive ball python. They produce these spectacular color patterns on very sick animals, and they sell them. The most expensive snake in these worlds sold for $100,000. Basically, if you produce one of these animals that shows a novel mutation, you can sell it to others because they'll get their capital back when they breed it and sell those babies, if it's not too sick. Here's a condor python. They're usually green, but it comes with a money-back guarantee. If it turns green, I'll replace it. So these are all bred to have these unusual designer color patterns. Here's a lizard from Afghanistan. You can buy this one for super cheap, just hundreds, thousands of animals. And this is at the Daytona Reptile Expo that happens every year. So just all these animals in tiny little plastic containers, just acres, literally, of animals in plastic. That's Greg Maxwell jamming a baby rat down the snake's mouth. So the book also describes frogs, which are a little bit in between snakes and birds in terms of being personable. Some species will respond to human desires for touch. Others, it's better not to touch. With frogs, they're really vulnerable. I told you about the fungus in the beginning, but there's all sorts of other things that can kill frogs. If you use chlorinated water in your frog tank, that's one very quick and easy way to kill the animal in your care. A lot of lotions that we use and soaps are toxic to frogs. So while we have these desires to touch, sometimes the touch is lethal. But what the book really tries to do is look at, again, these bubbles of hope and happiness. So this is the lemur leaf frog. It's endangered. It doesn't have a place to live. There was a big land buying campaign where it comes from in the highlands of Costa Rica. But after the Save the Rainforest campaign raised tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy up this forest, thousands of ecotourists arrived, and one of them brought that fungus on their boot. So the very year that all the tourists showed up, frogs like this one started disappearing in the wild. So it now lives in polluted ditches in San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica. The pollution is strong enough to kill the fungus, but not the frog. And it's also proliferating in people's basements and bedrooms. So it's a story, the usual story that you hear about the wildlife trade is how our consumptive desires are driving populations in the wild to the brink of extinction and sometimes beyond. But the story I tell in the book about the frogs is a modest story of hope, how people have learned to care for these animals in intimate spaces. Again, learning along the way, sometimes making mistakes, sometimes killing those in their care. But bringing capital together with these lively sense of ethics. So Donna Haraway talks about lively capital, where ethics and capital and commerce all come together. And I think that the case of this particular species of endangered frog is one where breeding and production and human kinship networks and desires for touch come together in a space that sustains a life form in an era of mass extinction. This is a zoo that's taking care of a lot of frogs. Part of the story is that the official institutions that are responsible for managing endangered life forms don't have any money right now. They launched a capital campaign in the year 2008, the year of the frog, They tried to raise $50 million, but they didn't realize when they were planning this that the global financial collapse would happen in 2008. So instead of raising $50 million, they barely stayed afloat. They barely met their operating expenses. So there's 6,000 species of frog that have been described by scientists, and about 2/3 of those are on the brink of extinction. The amphibian arc is taking care of 10 species. That leaves about 2,990 species that are effectively orphaned in this era of extinction, and that will be lost unless people adopt them, like some people have done with the relief frog. So I'd like to pan out a little bit in concluding here. So again, some people who take these animals into their household and love them don't know how to care for the animals, and they quickly die. Consumer desires for exotic pets, and we could talk for a while about exoticism. Anthropology has a long tradition of critiquing these desires for the exotic. But this consumer desire for exotic pets has definitely contributed to population declines in seemingly far-off corners of the globe. In some cases, the market is driving extinctions. But my question is, in these cases, how do we twist death back into life? And the question for me is not just who should we love in this era of extinction, which forms of life should get included in our households, which forms of life should be put into these salvic arcs, even though that whole discourse, the messianic Noah's Ark discourse, is so problematic on so many levels. You know, we've got to think about those logics of inclusion, but we also have to think about how we should love in an era of extinction. And maybe think about how queer politics might give us new resources for answering some of these questions. So one of the key questions of this book, Emergent Ecologies, How Should We Love, often comes with preordained answers in line with dominant political projects and economic interests. Political ideas about belonging offer deceptively simple plans of action. Kill the aliens, love the natives. Chemical industries with vested economic interests in monocrop agriculture offer answers based on the same kind of deadly distinctions. Poison the pests, fertilize the crops. Conservation practitioners, policymakers, and farmers are already moving beyond these simple dichotomies. People belong to heterogeneous political communities these days, and we're starting to move beyond xenophobic discourses of the 20th century. At least that's what I wrote in 2012. I'm not sure that's the case in 2017, which is really tragic. Restoration ecologists and nature lovers are finding that wayward and unpredictable forms of life can generate new niches, new habitats, new opportunities for symbiotic attachments, even as these wayward and unpredictable forms of life disrupt established ecological assemblages. When we participate in market economies, grow our own vegetables, we are casting our lots with some ways of life and not others. Life and death are at stake every time we eat, buy clothes at the store, or flip an electric light switch. We have unescapable entanglements with powerful assemblages that telegraphically met out bad deaths and cascading chains of destruction in ecological communities. And this unescapable fact has led many environmental advocates to sadness and to cynicism. Despite a groundswell of popular action, global climate change is outpacing all attempted solutions. Capitalist enterprises are rapidly destroying forests and wetlands in diverse corners of the globe, and these too may well be unstoppable. Recognizing these facts of life have led many to feelings of futility. Critics hover around the halls of the academy, lambasting all for complicity in these assemblages, but doing little to love, to live, and to fight. Alongside legions of cynical critics, as well as communities of experts and working professionals that promote corporate and government interests, there's a multitude of tinkers and thinkers that are transforming feelings of futility into concrete action, cynicism into happiness and hope. And I want you to think about those domestic spaces that I was describing as examples of those spaces of happiness and hope. And happiness is a complicated word. Sarah Ahmed has written a whole book about it, and we can talk about that in a bit. But in closing, I want you to think about how these tinkers and thinkers are forging convivial alliances, exploring wild possibilities. By sustaining these multi-species families, these creative agents are caring for things and beings that are ready at hand. They're getting these things from flea markets, Craigslist. There's also organic intellectuals that are gardening in the ruins. Anna Singh is described about finding delectable fruits and mushrooms in blasted landscapes. People like Karen Boland are finding new companions while wandering through haunted and weedy wrecks of ecological communities. Microbes are awakening pleasures in us that eclipse any purely utilitarian calculations. Animals and plants are stirring our interests and desires, using us to multiply their forces. I ask, what sort of novel ecological assemblages might we build together? Can we construct new ecosystems in our houses, in our backyards, in abandoned places, while embracing social justice concerns, while grappling with the subjective experience of other organisms, while upholding conservation values, all at the same time? Can we craft tactful proposals to those who we love, offering links to our social worlds and industrial supply chains, while keeping windows open that give them opportunities to escape? Thank you.
So we have time for questions, and I'll let you field your own.
Great.
So I have many questions. This is super interesting, but I'll just start with one. I was struck by the fact that you refer to these animals at points. I mean, you mentioned how the breeders refer to them as their babies, but you also, I can't remember the phrasing you used to call them like human, like some human. Am I right?
I think that the word is maybe personhood.
Yes, exactly. And I was
Yeah.
really curious about, like, I'm sure there's something at stake in your choice to use that as opposed to pet.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't know much about the field, so if you could just talk a little bit about that distinction and why you're not calling them pets or domesticated. Like, what's new about this that wasn't already in the domestication of animals?
Let me bring you back to Peter Singer. So you got really mad at me for calling pets flexible persons. So we did an event at Princeton last year where I brought Daphne on the line. We had a virtual seminar where Peter and her came together. So personhood and philosophy is a really, really specific thing. And Peter was getting upset that us anthropologists were poaching and purloining that word and sort of twisting it to our own flexible ends. So I think what Daphne has done is attended to ways of speaking and thinking in Israel in a really situated kind of way, like what the person is in this one particular historical cultural moment. And I think analogous things are happening here in these households. So in part what I'm trying to do is describe the language that is being used by Carolyn and other people that endow these other animals with you know forms of sociality and interaction that you know comport within these human-centered households. People like Carolyn are also attentive to the species-specific social worlds and not just unilaterally imposing you know what our demands on their world might be, but sort of looking at those subtle places of corporeal interaction where we might play and do things together. And I think there is, you know, like the power relations in these households is really clear. You know, there's modes of resistance, like if you're a bird, you can bite. If you see a crack in the window or in the door, you can dart outside. You know, there's all sorts of regimes of coercion here. You know, that food is withheld and given to sort of force modes of bodily comportment. But I think, you know, alongside of just attending to the language that is at play in these spaces, I also want to return to a conversation that happened in this room about 2 hours ago where we were talking about just the lively conversation on anthropomorphism right now. Mechanomorphism is an assumption that goes back to Descartes, that animals are like machines. That, you know, like in Descartes' day, we had clocks and waterworks, and we used those as sort of metaphors and figures of how animals worked. And I think there's a collective fatigue around the mechanomorphism. And I think definitely anthropomorphism can get in the way of our understanding of these subjectivities that are grounded in really different bodies, really different sensoria, really different. I mean, imagine what life is like to have wings and a beak and claws. It's just a really different mode of embodiment. So I think like the machine metaphor, the imposing of the human form, the imposing of the human norm of sociability, the imposing of human ideas about desire and love onto these others can conceal some of the dynamics that are going on, but I think it also reveals. And what I'm interested in this space that I tried to describe are those shared social spaces, those sort of negotiated places where different expectations about sociality kind of meet up. And then places where they don't meet up. So like the finches and the snakes, where they're absolutely refusing to respond at all to what we expect of them in a social sense.
Yeah, I was coming home one day and noticed an abundance of roadkill, okay? You know, and then I had a dream that night, and I was thinking, boy, I wonder if the if the animals were going to evolve so that they can resist automobiles or trucks and things like that. But aside from that, I know that I've read with some stories where people have seen a lot of animals killed in a certain area, and they went to the town or county and had tunnels built under the roads so that they could pass without getting killed. But it really freaked me out when I imagined seeing an animal that was going to, overtake my car.
I curated a show in New York last summer, orbiting around the themes of this book, and one of my key collaborators, Lisette Olivares, her partner Cheto, did a performance with roadkill, and ever since I've been noticing it in all kinds of ways. So what he'd done was just driving around the suburban landscape of New Jersey, just started noticing things like dead baby deers and hawks, and collecting them and storing them in a freezer. So Cheto comes from Chile, and his father was tortured under the Pinochet regime. And he wanted in this performance for us to think about the violence done to his father, but also the violence done to vermin, people who are treated like vermin who are crossing the border from Latin America into the US. The performance involved cutting himself. He was reenacting some of the violence done to his father and also trying to presence that violence at the border, but also thinking about like roads as borders that intersect through these multi-species communities, these ecological communities that are being disrupted by our infrastructure and architecture. And I think the question of adaptation, it's one, like you go back to classic biology textbooks, there's the moths that I guess became blacker in English factory towns as trees were covered with soot. The moths that were camouflaged to be hidden with the tree bark were suddenly visible to birds. So as birds picked off the gray moths from the blackened trees, moths became increasingly black. And I think, there's all manner of adaptations that are happening all around us all the time. And that's in part what I'm trying to presence with this notion of the ontological amphibian, that there's certain forms of life, whether they're microbial or whether they're animal or plant, that are responding to the built landscape, that are flourishing in zones of abandon. So even as some die, and this is definitely the case for frogs, so some frogs are flourishing in this moment when the chytrid fungus is sweeping through other worlds. So some frogs are asymptomatic carriers of the chytrid fungus and are actually expanding their range as other frog species are dying out. But I think one reviewer of my book sort of conflated what I was trying to do with this notion of novel ecosystems. There's a group of ecologists who, in almost a sort of a celebratory mode, talk about ecological communities that are coming into being. amidst industrial disasters and amidst agriculture and all sorts of things. For me, the notion of emergence, the notion of emergent ecologies, very much presences the destruction. At the same time, it presences the ability to find exploits in these dominant systems. So yeah, for me, the idea of an emergent ecological assemblage, whether it's structured by a road that kills creatures that try to cross it, or an emergent ecological assemblage that involves some sort of adaptive architecture that's trying to attend to modes of migration and patterns of daily life of others, is ultimately sort of an ambivalent thing. I mean, I definitely don't want to celebrate the ongoing violence and ongoing destruction. I want to cherish some of these forms of endangered life that are being destroyed by our contemporary architectures and modes of being in the world. But at the same time, I don't want to, part of the book is really trying to get past this notion of the alien invader and just sort of, in Florida in particular, they've learned that you can't eradicate these animals, that try as you might, you cannot eliminate Burmese pythons from the Everglades, no matter how many rednecks that you pay with a $50,000 bounty for a snake, they're going to still run wild and escape our ability to kill and control. So it's trying to think about, given the fact that a final solution isn't possible, this is this dream of Kant, there's going to be this global government that war is going to end and the only violence in the world will be police action. That's not going to happen in human worlds, and that's not going to happen in these ecological communities. So how do we live with animals like the ones that Carolyn has created and released? How do we live with the fact that these forms of life are flying wild from human enterprises? I don't think the solution of, as much as I love people in my life who are native plant advocates and native animal advocates, I don't think killing, at least certain modes of killing, is the way to live in the current moment and into the future.
Thank you for your talk. Good to see you again. I'm going to keep going in this mode. My interest is in the fact that you're talking about Florida. It's very warm, it's very rich. Okay. And now we're in Minnesota. And so, it's very not warm.
I'm from Florida, by the way.
Right.
And my family's kind of redneck too,
Like
so we'll talk about it.
So, emergent ecologies is really interesting. There's this vibrancy that you're talking about that can occur, but it really can occur only in certain places. And so, I'm interested in hearing more about how you incorporate the problem of weather. The problem of this bigger problem of there really are places where you're just not going to get that easily a sort of new ecology, right? A new or more diverse, or right. So if you've thought about that, way in which you sort of identify the possibilities on kind of a global scale for, right, emergent ecologies. And I'll just give you one quick example. There's this, and I'm sure you've seen the parrot documentary, the Telegraph documentary, but even before I saw that, when I was in the Tokyo Library, Tokyo University, you look out the window and there's this parrot community there. But Tokyo can get pretty cold. And so I did wonder, how many generations is this flock? Or what? Or do they move? Do they migrate? And so I guess in terms of your framework for this problematic, when do you just not really have flexibility, for these kinds of ecologies to emerge?
So in response to your question, I'd like to presence the emergent ecologies in this room, in your gut, in your own body, the sorts of convivial and sometimes dyspeptic assemblages that are a result of your patterns of consumption and ways of moving through the world. There's we're just now starting to grapple with this unruly, ecological community that in some ways makes us who we are, and vice versa. There's all sorts of emerging literatures about, and this is something I'm dealing with in the new book, and I'm still sort of muddling through how to make sense of some of these scientific claims about how microbes mediate things like our cognition and things like our moods. One of the student groups that I follow in my new book are these hackers from London that read some scientific papers about serotonin that's produced by E. coli in our gut, and they've created these hacked microbes with that CRISPR tool I was talking about earlier that are happier, that make us happier. So there's probably not too many genetically modified microbes in your gut or guts in this room, but there's all sorts of ways that the ecological assemblage that you live with is shaped by your histories of antibiotics, your patterns of eating certain foods that might contain chemical residues or that might have gone through certain industrial assemblages. So I guess what I'm in part trying to do with this notion of emergent ecologies is just think, and maybe this is sort of getting, last night you were so a lot has happened in this room in the last 24 hours. So you were talking about sort of ecology without culture, and I guess part of the claim of emergent ecologies, I guess maybe, I'm a Donna Haraway student, like nature culture all the way down. So trying to think about the ecologies that inhabit us as, part of our cyborg and industrial articulations, and part of, beyond this room, we're not going to have like parrots probably flourishing in Minnesota, but Adam Zaretsky released some albino mice not too far from here a few years back, and he did this installation called Workhorse Zoo that was, I don't know, how far is Salinas, Kansas from here? It's probably kind of far. Yeah. It's not
10 hours maybe.
10 hours. It's relatively close. Maybe a little bit warmer than here. So Adam wanted to do this exhibit called Workhorse Zoo in San Francisco, and it was too controversial for San Francisco, so he brought it to Kansas, and he basically lived in this biosecure facility for a whole week, where he had fruit flies, he had rats, he had Arabidopsis, the mustard plant, he had E. coli bacteria, all these organisms that have emerged in these realms of hyper-domestication. So Sarah Franklin talks about, another theorist of wildness, she talks about how the wild used to be imagined as opposed to the domestic, how wild geese or wild boar were different from domesticated geese or domesticated boars. And what Sarah Franklin has tried to describe is the forms of wildness emerging within laboratories, emerging within these realms of hyper-cultivation. So what Adam was trying to do with this installation is give a presence to these forms of wildlife that are proliferating within laboratory infrastructures, and then he released them to see what would happen. And I think some of the mice survived. Fruit flies don't do so well in cold weather, but they can get around in buildings. He was basically playing with organisms whose genomes have been annotated and altered, and celebrating ways that they might go wild. So I think, like any, I think going back to Sloterdijk in the beginning, thinking about the cagedness of different organismal ontologies. I think, this is a more intense cage, I think, than Florida. But I think that old, like there's old literatures in ecology that assume sort of an organism-environment fit. And part of what I'm trying to show is that fit is more or less loose or tight, depending on what kind of critter you are.
Yeah, exactly. And it's more or less fit or tight depending on maybe the weather, too. I mean, so you've got the organism and some kind of symbiotic relationship, something like that, but you still have that loose or fit
Yeah, and I think it might just be in terms of scales, and I think,
Yeah.
like, it's easy for us to see parrots, it's easy for us to see big trees. Mammals are readily intelligible to us. But I bet microbial ecologies here are just as wild and unruly, perhaps less diverse. I don't know.
In my
like,
head, I'm really thinking of the poles.
the tropics, yeah.
I'm thinking of poles mostly, but
Yeah.
anyway, it's just sort of add to that model, another layer.
Yep.
I have like two questions that are very similar to each other. The first one is, you mentioned the problem of how some people who try to like adopt per se like animals that aren't really meant to be domesticated, like snakes, or I like snakes, but I think was the prominent one in your presentation. Well, my question is, and it's more of a subjective question, but would you trust like any ordinary person to be able to adopt a snake or like an undomesticated animal? Because it seems like sometimes like people don't know how to like take care of an animal properly, and like say sometimes like force the animal to like do what they want. So like my example would be like, you saw like that guy, I think his name was Greg, and he just tried like force feeding the snake like a rat, which I thought was kind of a little bit vulgar to me, and I thought it was a little bit inappropriate. So I was wondering, are some animals just not meant to be domesticated? Are they meant to be taken care of by like some kind of like a zookeeper or like an animal expert? Like I know that man was probably like an animal expert, like as you mentioned it as a top expert in snakes, but it just struck me that you could buy a snake for like $75 and then treat it however you wanted, especially like, I'm not sure if it was an endangered species or not, but I mean, I don't know, that just struck out to me. Like, what is your view on that?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of complicated things in your question, and one is sort of like who has license to sort of operate in these worlds and engage in sort of in experimentation. This guy Greg Maxwell, I don't think ever took a veterinary course, or he just sort of learned along the way from other snake enthusiasts. So part of it, I think, like norms circulate in society, and laws kind of govern ways that we can interact with animals. And within the US, the legal landscape is one of plurality. So in Florida, it's super simple to keep basically any kind of life. There's certain animals that are more they're basically classed in terms of how dangerous they are to people. And then there's another class for like, if they escape, are they going to cause economic damage or ecological damage? So things like gorillas or chimps or lions and tigers are class 1 animals, which doesn't mean in Florida you can't keep them. It means you have to do a little bit of extra paperwork. So for class 1 animals, there's all kinds of caging requirements. I think that's the one. I need to, and actually, Gene, you might know this better than me, but I might be mistaken in saying this, but I think for class 1 animals, you have to be 16 years old. You have to have 2 letters of recommendation, and one of the letters can't be from your mom or your dad. And you got to fill out an application, and I think it's like a $30 or $60 fee. They do come to inspect your cages, and I know some of these wildlife officers, and they have undercover wildlife officers. There's all sorts of amazing Animal Planet episodes that could be made in Florida that would be really fun to watch. But yeah, this idea of ethics and trust. I mean, we sort of live in this era of deregulation and unregulated encounters, and I think like there's laws in the books, and then there's like all sorts of well-meaning animal enthusiasts, some of whom are trying to save animals and keep them in sanctuaries. I don't know. It's hard to like come up with a sort of like definitive ethical normative stick and apply them to all these different encounters. I think it basically gets worked out situationally. So a lot of these wildlife officers who I know who are policing the laws and policing norms and policing what you can and can't do with these animals are often super pragmatic. So even if it is a 16-year-old with a letter recommendation from mom and like, you know, their high school biology teacher or whoever, often they know that if that animal is taken into a different context, it could be facing just as sort of dire and difficult circumstances. So often these wildlife officers will sort of work with the kids and try to train them to be better at doing what they're enthusiastic about doing. And I think one of the things to be thinking about here is not just sort of like, do I categorically grant trust to this kind of person, but thinking about the power asymmetries that pervade these kind of situations, thinking about the vulnerabilities of these animals in these situations. A lot of the laws in our norms are structured about what's dangerous to us. A lot of these animals, you know, if they die or get seriously hurt, there's not a lot of like moral or legal sanctions that are brought against people. So I think, yeah, rather than sort of saying I trust this person or don't, I guess I would encourage people to just think about those power asymmetries and how things like food and caging and all of this structure these encounters in human dominated households where, yeah, ultimately I think the law kind of breaks down. You enter these spaces, they're like the word ecology comes from oikos, the household, the Greek word for household, and the state doesn't really penetrate these spaces that much. So people are working this out on their own.
Right. I just found it really interesting, like the way you brought up like power struggle, because it seems like when you said the phrase like right always wins, it kind of seems like, I mean, this dude was, to be like completely honest, it was like borderline like animal torture, because this dude every time the snake, every time it would spit out the rat, he would just shove it back into its mouth, and it just seems more of a power struggle than it maybe comes off to be, and especially because you're trusting these owners to take care of a species that may be endangered soon. That's just how it comes off. But yeah, thank you for your insight.
Yeah, I think of Guantanamo Bay nasal feeding tubes every time I think of Greg.
Yeah.
You have mentioned over the course of your talk several different words, whether it be personhood for animals or domestication or pets, and perhaps you could elaborate just a little bit more for me the differences you see between those kind of terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think maybe, yeah, I'll try to like understand what Caroline means when she says, I'm not going to sell this one, it's a pet. So I think for her, yeah, it's interesting. So she's using these familial terms, these terms of affection, calling them her babies, but that's somehow a more flexible category than the category of pet for her. I think maybe outside of her household, like pet sort of downgrades like certain relationships. Like I think in most people's household, like you have your baby and your pet, and it's kind of confusing the way that she's using language there. I guess I'm interested in some of the slipperiness amongst those categories, and like that idea of domestication is one that's been recently turned on its head by a lot of scholars. So Jim Scott at Yale, Anna Singh at Santa Cruz have encouraged us to think about the changes that domesticated plants and animals have engendered in us. So Jim Scott talks about the ways that early cities were basically formed and stable settlement patterns were formed in response to the demands of very fragile plants that had life cycles that depended on humans for their care. So basically thinking about the plant's mode of being in the world that forces a change in human settlement patterns and human society. I think Anna Singh is picking up a similar thread. To basically think about ways that, you know, if domestication was once figured as this taming, this changing of biological material to sort of suit our interests and needs, there's an increasing move to try to think about this dynamic interplay between, you know, as changes emerge in plants, as changes emerge in animals, what changes do we have to make to our own selves? So I think in these households, part of the dynamic that I was trying to describe at the beginning is just those daily routines of love and care and feeding. So yeah, what I was trying to do is attend to the ways that language is being used, and kind of move between those what classic anthropologists would call emic categories, the categories of meaning within a given linguistic situation, and etic categories. So those are the theoretical that travel from site to site. So I think what you're picking up on is sometimes I was moving a little fast and loose between what Carolyn said and, you know, what Daphne says about flexible personhood.
Yeah, this question might interest you because I knew this gal one time who wanted to be a veterinarian, okay? And so she came down from Connecticut to northern Georgia and trying to get into the University of Georgia, Athens. Well, it's hard to get into vet school, okay? And so she rented a farmhouse outside of Athens, and of course she was networking and whatnot and trying to get into school there. And meanwhile, a lot of animals started showing up at her door, different species that needed help. I just wondered if you'd comment on that, you know? I mean, communication, they were communicating somehow.
Or maybe one of the things that Anna Singh was just mentioning is writing about lately are the arts of noticing and the ways that we might train ourselves to notice things and in landscapes that are changing, in cities where forms of life might largely be invisible and made visible. So maybe I'd sort of turn that question on its head and say, rather than some sort of communicative act from, you know, the human world to the animal world that sort of summons them, perhaps what was going on is just her attunement to life forms that she hadn't noticed before. And so part of what Anna Singh is calling for in the environmental humanities and anthropology and multispecies ethnography is for us to brush up on our arts of noticing, to figure out what sort of tactics and techniques and modes of telling stories we might deploy to give presence to these others that are living with us in the world.
A lot of what your comments seem to be focused on the household sort of level, and really very interesting. I guess I was wondering, thinking beyond that, if you had any observations about how these households, especially social and economically, what strategies, unique strategies they do to survive, because there's pet stores and capitalism and hunters and all those other forces out there, and these people are not just individual households that are surviving, but are they forming co-ops or social groups or the various things they do socially and economically, especially in this case, to survive?
Yeah, I think the flea market is one of these spaces in you know, suburban and rural Florida, where those collectives are I guess networked and enacted. I think there's a lot of you know, there's been a lot of writing in anthropology about informal economies. I think there's a lot of sort of mutual aid and yeah, so a lot of people like Carolyn are breeding these pets in hopes of making money, and sometimes the bets and gambles they make on a particular animal don't work out so well, and sometimes those costs of food and costs of caging, costs of just keeping up the household, you know, things start to fall apart. And I think in those circumstances, as they go every Saturday to this parking lot behind a church, yeah, people are attentive and loaning people things, giving people cages, giving people, you know, donating food sometimes. And I think there's also, there's sort of a slippery slope or fuzzy boundaries between some of the spaces that Jean was characterizing, like the sanctuary movement, where it's kind of a non-profit, community-supported space where a lot of the daily labor to keep animals healthy and fed and loved is farmed out to kids who've committed crimes and are ordered to do community service. And people are just trying to get by in these environments. There's a lot of books you can find on the internet that sort of tell you how to get rich by breeding animals, and some of those authors make a little money off the books. Greg Maxwell, the guy who jams the dead baby rats down the snake's throat, he's a best-selling author. I think he's probably sold more books than those of us here in this room. But yeah, these are all people in situations of precarity, and in these situations of precarity, trying to sustain these households with people that they love in them, with animals that they love in them, is a difficult prospect. And I think rather than, you asked about sort of collectives and co-ops, I think rather than incorporated associations, I did see some of those in the realms of like the frog conservation groups, but a lot of it's like for-profit business kind of things. And then just sort of the informal, like at a lot of these sanctuaries, it's just a cobbling together of whatever resources are at hand. So maybe it's getting donations from the local butcher, or corporate sponsors from local businesses. But yeah, very, very precarious situations.
Is there any difference between an emergent ecology and a constructed ecology?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, so I guess my question would be back to you to think about the agents of construction. So part of what I'm trying to do is, and I mentioned this last night, is kind of get past Latour. So Bruno Latour, this scholar of science and society, thinks about networks and thinks about ways that non-humans might be linked together in networks, but very much looks at the human role in creating these assemblages. And what this book is trying to do is look at, not so much in this chapter, but other chapters, look at the ways that other kinds of entrepreneurial agents are bringing assemblages into being. So yeah, these ecologies are constructed, but it's not all the doing of these humans that Bruno Latour talks about doing the work of interessement. It's these surprising emergences that sometimes create disasters for others and opportunities for some. So I think maybe the word constructed implies a little bit too much like planning and maybe intentionality. And I think it's what I'm trying to characterize is a multitude of agents finding exploits on the fly, and the assemblages that come into being as all these agents are sort of interacting and intra-acting, to use Karen Barad's term, with each other, in situations where intentionality and control and life and death are not always clearly plotted out. So that's, so maybe constructed isn't quite what I was going for. Jean.
I don't know if you're speaking of ontological flexibility exclusively in the sense of a species capacity, or not, because at one moment in your talk you said something about certain individuals might be more ontologically flexible than others, but it strikes me that it's possible to have an ontological flexibility that's not for reasons of biology or particular species embodiment, but for reasons of temperament or personal history. And I was thinking when you were talking about the cockatiels and the small birds that in my experience doing fieldwork in Parrot Sanctuary, there's a reason for those smaller birds not being very interested in human worlds or particularly interactive with human worlds, and it's because most of them lived with other small birds. So a human household that took in small birds would typically have more than one, would have a companion. Whereas these larger birds like cockatoos, macaws, Amazons, much more apt to be the single bird in the household. And so, and the same thing is probably true when they're reared in the pet trade to some extent, that, you know, the smaller birds have more of an interactive, you know, rearing than the larger birds. I'm less sure about that part. So, you know, it could be not that the cockatiels aren't flexible enough as a species to enter human worlds, but more a matter of, well, they don't need to, because they have a perfectly good flock with not necessarily their own species, but other species of a similar size that they might interact with. So that was one question about ontological flexibility, and the other one was that, or comment maybe.
Yeah.
But the other one is that it seems like you're talking about it, or let's see, I forget who you're taking. It's Slaughterhouse, right?
Slaughterdyke.
Slaughterdykes.
I like Slaughterhouse though.
Right, if you ever need to make fun of him for any reason, we can call him Slaughterhouse. Anyway, so it seems like, you know, it's, at least in the way you're talking about it, it has more to do with the kind of, they're flexible because they can enter the human world. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, or if you have anything to say about kind of ontological flexibility that brings different species together, or different genuses together in a way, through these emergent ecologies, in a way that is also strikingly bizarre, or queer, or, you know, however you want to think about it, you know. I mean, not necessarily queer in an erotic sense, but, you know, just oddball relationships, you know. Do frogs develop oddball relationships with other species because of these emergent ecological situations, or what you refer to in your book as these kind of wild, you know, environments?
For the second bit, I would point you towards Tracy Warkentin, one of my former colleagues at CUNY, who's written about odd couples. So like orangutans and tortoises that hang out together. And one of my friends who's a biologist told me about this rhinoceros and a giraffe, two males in San Diego Zoo that have a particular fondness for each other. And I think, yeah, I mean, Tracy's work is largely focused on conditions of captivity, and I think there's, like, within the biological community, sort of an assumption of like these conditions corrupt the essential animal nature or propensities of these animals, and but I also see, like, in, I don't know, you know, I think biologists are starting to attend to surprising associations in these domains that are perceived to be outside of human. You know, arguably, like the current era, the Anthropocene, humans are everywhere, or at least our chemicals or nuclear radiation or whatever is transforming landscapes in one way or the other everywhere. So yeah, I think there's all sorts of queer and unexpected assemblages that are coming into being. Let's see, remind me of your first question. Oh, your first question was about, I think.
Well, the ontological flexibility possibly not being a matter of species biology.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I think there's maybe as I was thinking about it and writing the book and talking about it just now, a way that, a sort of species determinism kind of can creep in, and I think, the presumption of inflexibility. So that guy who I was talking about, Slaughterdyke, gets his ideas from Heidegger, and Heidegger gets his ideas about inflexibility by a very peculiar reading of this Estonian biologist named Jakob von Uxkol, who describes the tick as the figure of the animal that, in his words, in Heidegger's words, has a poor world. So in this essay, famously, the tick can only detect light, so it crawls up on plants. It can smell butyric acid, which is what mammals emit. So if butyric acid is in the air, it's likely to drop off, and then it starts crawling and is seeking a hot membrane, and if it finds brain it starts sucking. If you read the contemporary tick biology literature, it turns out that ticks are not confined to that little ontological cage. Like von Huckel thought and like Heidegger thought that their world is much livelier and more dynamic than we once thought. They have social assembly hormones, for example, so that if they're many species of tick, so that if they found a nice hot body, mammalian body to suck blood from, they release this chemical that summons other ticks. So I think that's like encouraging. Yeah. So I think it's super easy to assume that other kinds of life that we don't know that well are impoverished in some way, or bounded in some kind of way, or inflexible in some kind of way. And I think your reminder to me to think about these small birds is, and I think your comment was really saying like, you know, maybe there's something about these macaws and these bigger birds. They don't have members of their own social world there to interact with. So maybe they have some kind of psychological need that a human fulfills in a way that these smaller birds would.
Well, and if they've been raised in captivity, often they're raised by humans rather than by their mother birds, and so they lose the capacity to be attracted, in a sense, to other birds. And they don't have that social and erotic attraction.
Yeah, but I think one of the things, let's see, I was connecting dots a moment ago, and now I've forgotten. I'm getting tired and need more caffeine. But it's probably about time to wrap up. But I think, you know, there's even in a social biography of an animal, a lot of the literature about imprinting assumes that things get fixed at an early age. But I think it's possible to have, you know, you talk about in your talk about the door opening and this encounter that wasn't sure what it was going to be. Was it going to be violent? Was it going to be some sort of transformative thing? You know, I think we're starting to learn that these social relations that we once thought were fixed. So birds go through these critical periods. People do it too, and you know, so there's a great movie that I suggest you all go out and watch called My Life as a Turkey, where this guy basically, someone delivers turkey eggs to his doorstep, and of course, what does he do? He dedicates the next year of his life to like raising these turkeys and teaching them to live in an environment because they don't have a mother, and they imprint on him. And imprinting is something that happens like, it happens with different kinds of life in different moments, but with these turkeys, it's kind of like the first thing that they see is this human, and all of a sudden they're fixated on the human form and have weird modes of relating to other turkeys. But it turns, like, if you watch that movie to the end, you find out that like eventually those turkeys have this violent confrontation with the human and leave him behind and sort of get along just fine without him. So I think, yeah, this notion that animals have this get stuck or get fixed, whether it's in a psychological way or this like ontological, genetically wired kind of way, yeah, always deserves to be questioned and explored.
Well, I hate to cut this off, but it is time to do that. So let's give Dr. Kirksey a big round of applause. And we'll see you next week upstairs in Best Buy Theater.